صلوات على محمد وآل محمد. We'll start the program with the recitation of Quran.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات سندخلهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا لهم فيها أزواج مطهرة وندخلهم ظلا ظليلا. إن الله يأمركم أن تؤدوا الأمانات إلى أهلها وإذا حكمتم بين الناس أن تحكموا بالعدل إن الله نعم ما يعظكم به إن الله كان سميعا بصيرا. يا أيها الذين آمنوا أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم فإن تنازعتم في شيء فردوه إلى الله والرسول إن كنتم تؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر ذلك خير وأحسن تأويلا. ألم تر إلى الذين يزعمون أنهم آمنوا بما أنزل إليك وما أنزل من قبلك يريدون أن يتحاكموا إلى الطاغوت وقد أمروا أن يكفروا به ويريد الشيطان أن يضلهم ضلالا بعيدا. وإذا قيل لهم تعالوا إلى ما أنزل الله وإلى الرسول رأيت المنافقين يصدون عنك صدودا. فكيف إذا أصابتهم مصيبة بما قدمت أيديهم ثم جاءوك يحلفون بالله إن أردنا إلا إحسانا وتوفيقا. أولئك الذين يعلم الله ما في قلوبهم فأعرض عنهم وعظهم وقل لهم في أنفسهم قولا بليغا. وما أرسلنا من رسول إلا ليطاع بإذن الله ولو أنهم إذ ظلموا أنفسهم جاءوك فاستغفروا الله واستغفر لهم الرسول لوجدوا الله توابا رحيما. صدق الله العلي العظيم.
Thank you very much for that recitation. We're now very fortunate to have Krish Raval, who will be speaking to us on leadership from theory to practice. Let's welcome him with a round of applause. Krish Raval is the founder and director of Faith in Leadership, Britain's main leadership development organization for lay and clerical faith personnel. He was the inaugural director of the Church Leadership Fellows in partnership with the Moller Institute and is a regular contributor to the BBC's radio's Pause for Thought. He was awarded an OBE for services to leadership education and to Inter-faith Cohesion, and we're very fortunate to have him today.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be with you, and I grew up just around the corner. So the fact that you're having me, I'm not from your community in one sense, but I am from another. It just means the world to me. So I just need to make sure that this works. Okay, there we go. So we're going to talk in two parts. The first part is to tell you about leadership. And the second part then, and the most compelling part, is a conversation that I'm going to have with Miqdad when we're going to talk about something that I'm referring to as prophetic leadership. All traditions have amazingly valuable precepts and concepts. And it would be a real shame if modern ideas supplanted ancient wisdom. And my thesis is that all traditions have something to give our country, but especially Islam. Partly because in about 10 years' time, Miqdad will know more about this than me, but possibly 1 in 5 Brits will be Muslim. And if those communities are not well led, not just internally, but across the board, then we all lose out. So the fact that there is such a rich tradition of leadership within Islam and it is not known is a travesty for all of us. Does that make sense? So it's with that perspective that I wanted, and I kind of really roped Migdad into talking about leadership, because actually I've been working in the leadership field for about 30 years. I went to Rooksheath High School, just in South Harrow here. I got by grace alone to Cambridge University, and unlike Migdad, I found that I couldn't speak to people. I was chronically shy. And I knew how to study in books, but I didn't know how to talk to people across boundaries or negotiate or do anything that involved going out of my comfort zone. And really, leadership was a way of transcending some of these limiting beliefs. So shall we then go ahead and go and explore the landscape of leadership over the last 100 years, see how it kind of relates to all of us, and then go into the discussion? Is that okay? So what I wanted to firstly say is that there are, in leadership theory, as I teach leadership at universities, so in leadership theory, there are many definitions of leadership. And if somebody says, this is what leadership is, to the exclusion of everything else, they don't really know what they're talking about, in my opinion. So each of you can have an understanding of what leadership is. One commonly understood definition of leadership is when an individual influences a team of people to create a change in the world. So I came in and I'm confronted by this wonderful, vision, which is being manifested right next door. I know, and I was just talking to friends about this, that at every level there has been decision making. At every level, whether it's raising the funds, whether it's getting the idea off the ground, whether it's overcoming council objections, whether it's rallying the community together to say, yes, this is where we want it as opposed to that, there will be individuals who will have influenced other individuals to make some change, and it's multi-layered. So it's not just the idea of a heroic leader who says, this is what we're going to do and we're all going to do it. It can be really, really complex. And therefore you have team dynamics, you have so many other variables involved. So that's what leadership is. And leadership, the kind of field of leadership is dominated by a concept that is called adjective leadership. So you can have servant leadership, transformational leadership, transactional leadership, prophetic leadership, situational leadership. So you have a word, and then you have leadership, and that gives that expression to what kind of leadership it is. And so I want to just give you an overview of some of the main trends of leadership that have affected all our lives over the last 100 years. Is that okay? So I want to do this by looking at the discourses of leadership by my friend, Professor Simon Weston. Now, Simon, when I talk about concepts, I like to know about the people who came up with them, their lives, what they're like, and I'm sure you're the same. So Simon is still very much alive, living, and I've got permission. I told him that I was going to talk to him about you, and he was very, very happy. What? Yeah. So he wasn't always. He's known as one of the top leadership people now, but he wasn't born into a sort of leading family. In fact, he was born in a very poor estate in Bristol. He left school at the age of 16. His first job was in a factory, and he was just watching, doing some conveyor belt stuff, and seeing how people were being treated, and that kind of influenced him. And then they said, you should be a nurse. So at the age of 17, he became a nurse. And he was the only male guy in a majority female environment. and was exceptionalized as a result of that, and was the butt of many jokes and all sorts of things. And he dealt with the body. And then a few years later, he became a mental health nurse. And in those days, if you had mental health illness beyond a certain level, you were castigated into a hospital, and you'd just be there for decades. And he was one of the people who made a change. And then he went into family services. So from the body and the mind, he looked at systems, and he started helping families that had been exposed to so many pressures to stay together, or if they'd broken apart, understand what kind of dynamics make families cohere or, fall apart. And in this way, he became the head of family services for a major NHS trust. And then he went to, said, what I'm really looking at is kind of something called systems and strategy, and kind of got the idea that it's leadership. So then he went and studied it more and more and more, and got a doctorate at Lancaster University. It was top of his field. And somehow in the past he had a kind of casual relationship, and from there he got a boy and a son, and the son was 19. And I have permission to tell you that he got his doctorate. He was working with the NHS at one level first, and then suddenly working with big companies, in leadership, because he was, a rarity, somebody who's actually worked in the bowels and the depths of our, National Health Service now can talk about leadership at these big, big levels. And this 19-year-old boy was murdered, and his son. So then he just didn't know what to do, and he had to deal with his grief, and went to Ireland, where he still lives, and went to a monastery. And for about 2 years just didn't. And he wrote and studied, his love was leadership. He studied leadership, and he wrote leadership, a critical text, and then coaching, a critical text, and came up with these ideas of leadership. So I want to talk to you about his discourses of leadership, because I think it's really fitting. Okay, so he then, so don't kind of jump. This is a kind of next slide, maybe unfriendly. But what he's saying is that over the last 100 years, there are different narratives or different ways of looking at leadership. Controller, therapist, messiah, eco-leadership. And then I'm suggesting that what your tradition, I think all our faith traditions, but certainly your tradition, has something to offer on that, on eco-leadership, an extension of leadership, which is prophetic leadership, and I want to engage with Miqdad and you on that. So let me go through these things. So the first kind of mindset is the controller kind of discourse. And this is the idea that the leader is leadership is a top-down thing. By the way, before I go into that, let me just talk to you about leadership, just one other thing. So there's a distinction between a leader, the idea of leader, and leadership. They're two different things. Am I allowed to ask questions? Is that okay, or just make it interactive? So what do you think the difference is between the idea of a leader and leadership? What do you reckon? Yeah.
And the other thing is encompassing the whole group of people fielding their thoughts.
Yeah, so one thing's about, almost there. Yeah, please, sir.
I was thinking leader is a title, whereas leadership is the act.
I think that you're both right. Ladies, anything?
What comes to mind is that people can have leadership within say teams or without necessarily being the leader.
That's right. So leadership is at all levels, and that is absolutely right. Well, I mean, you're all right. Usually the idea is that the idea of a leader is it's a person, it's a noun, it's like a thing, the leader. Leadership involves a process, a whole series of ideas, a whole series of events, right? It's not just one thing. And so this idea of the controller, it's really rooted on the idea that it's not about leadership. Leadership is about the leader. So those of you who are, well versed in Machiavelli, you've heard of Machiavellian leadership. So if you read politics for hundreds of years in the West, but possibly even now, you would read a book called The Prince. The prince meant the leader. And the idea was that you can say whatever you want to say to anyone. You do whatever you want. You have to look like the leader. So you can come across as an angel, but actually you should practice the habits of a beast. That's what is written. Because your whole purpose of being a leader is to create stability, and that stability is only ensured if you are there as the leader. So it's about you. Like, ring any bells, right? So, and you go to any lengths to maintain your position. You can lie, you can cheat, it's all justified as long as you're there. And an extension of that, and for 500 years or so, this was, the prince was absolutely key to many ideas of leadership and politics and political engagement. So the controller mindset is that the leader is not anything but somebody with a title who will tell people what to do. And in the old days when I used to teach leadership, particularly in this country, and I used to ask people, like, can you draw a leader? Usually they'll try and draw somebody standing on a box, like a man, pointing at people, telling people what to do. And that's the controller mindset. So the people who built the railways in Africa, made from indentured labor, who had slaves, are, even to this day, I won't say which countries, but when I train in certain countries, people say, oh yeah, it's okay to kick people, literally kick people to get them to perform. So your job as a leader is to control. And the kind of extension of that then is that the people aren't people, they're just machines, they're cogs. So you can have people in a conveyor belt putting caps on a toothpaste, and just that's one level of it. The other level of it is that you will create business, you will create stoves, you will bid for machines, you will create machines that kill people. So in the Second World War, the big thing was the Holocaust, where people were taken into gas furnaces. Big companies, some of which are around today, bid for contracts to create machines that would kill people. It was all efficiency. And we see that not just in the Holocaust, we see that all sorts of places. So the idea is that people are just machines to make one or two people rich, or to create, to ensure stability. So that's a controller mindset. And guess what? Really, after the Second World War, this was seen as kind of not good. Now, it may not be seen as good because it's immoral, and that people are more than cogs or machines, and efficiencies, it's not good to just treat people as kind of efficient machine, like bits of a bigger machine. But also it's not good because people found that it wasn't particularly productive. If you have to kick somebody each time to kind of perform, it's not good for you as a boss. So that industrial model suddenly became out of favor. It still exists. No offense to people who deal with civil servants and bureaucrats, but you have come across it, right? That computer says no, you can't do that. I mean, I'm dealing with a legal case right now where, somebody's kind of rule-based understanding of things has contradicted the kind of outcome that is to do with natural justice. So there's these conflicts. So you have these people who are just very, 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 very rule-based, and they can't be shaken out of it. And an extreme version of that is also controller. Why should you do this? Because I'm your boss and you need to do it. Full stop. but the person say, well, it's not good. Forget it. I'm in charge. That's the controller mindset. Okay. So as an antidote, and really after the Second World War, when they saw how, machine learning and machine creations really killed people and weren't really very productive, the therapist model came. So this is where my trade actually comes in. It's the coach, the person who kind of accompanies you at work, the mentor. Okay, you're screwing things on, you're not happy, but you've got HR department, they'll listen to you. And it may be that people are valuing the workers and workforce because they're people, because they're human, but it's also because we want you to produce, we want you to perform more. And the more therapy, the more human environment, like humanization we make work, the more nice environment, the more convivial the environment it is, the better you'll perform. So you have the therapist model. And that then led to, in the 80s particularly, the messianic model. And my mentor, Professor James McGregor Burns, who's the only person who has written the Pulitzer, has written about leadership, who's won the Pulitzer, coined the phrase transformational leadership. So it's really the leader is there to transform. And he looked at history and he saw the great leaders, Saladin, Gandhi, you name it, Napoleon, they transformed. And the idea was the leader and the led are different sides of the same coin. So if, so say I'm leading this meeting, let's just say, and you're being led, you're my followers. Does that mean I'm in charge? Well, if you're the followers and suddenly you all walk out, then who's in charge? So the transformational leadership movement said that actually the followers are also leaders in one way, and there's very little difference between the leader and the led. But it also led to this sort of abundance of kind of charismatic leadership and superhuman feats and how to become a better human being by sleeping less and really pushing boundaries. And it was, and what it did was then create these kind of charismatic leaders in companies who created cult followings, cult followings. So a cult is very clearly based on a messianic leader. Why are you here? Well, I'm following this guy. Well, what about you? Do you have any ideas of where we're going? No, because I'm following that guy. Absolutely, quite so, right? So you have, and that's the thing, but you know this from school or from university, that if you have a small group and one person does all the work, it creates laziness amongst the other members. And it's a similar kind of thing. It gives you a false security that this guy's going to do something. He's usually a man, but if they go, teams usually fall apart. And so, I mean, and I'm not saying, I'm just giving you I'm not saying that's bad, I'm just giving you a critique or a critical understanding of this thing. So we need leaders, but this is where, again, in prophetic leadership, there is this big thing of humility. It's not about me, it's about something bigger, please. And you can do this too. We're in it together, Anyway, I'm going ahead of myself. So that was the dominant idea of leadership, that, you're the person who has all the answers, you're in charge, you do yoga, you do tai chi, you do karate, you do all these things, you've got the best degrees, and trust in me and everything will be good. And there was a reaction against that too, because what it did, as I say, not only creates a lazy workforce, but it creates bosses with great egos, and in the West, certainly, huge salaries, like a big differential of salaries. Messianic leadership. And understand the idea of messianic, the Messiah. The leader will save me. The rescuer model. And it attracts a particular kind of person who wants to be in a leadership position because he or she thinks they can rescue others, The United Nations system, if you go into the development world, it's full of people like this, right? So now the idea is that, and these discourses it's not that they've gone; they're still with us. They're just at different levels. The idea now is because of scarce resources, all the previous models of leadership were actually taking stuff from the earth, basically. It's ultimately depleting the resources of the earth. And the idea, this is Simon's idea, is that now we're in an era where we all need each other. We all need to do things together. And it is absolutely inefficient to understand that one person is a boss, or one person is a controller, or one person is gifted to the expense of someone else, because we're interdependent. And he did this before the COVID the pandemic, where it was very, very clear, which we so easily forget, very, very clear that our stability as a world depends on actually the state of the weakest people amongst us. If they have COVID, if they're ill, we'll all get it. And to answer these kind of problems, to solve these problems, we need to acknowledge our own interdependence. And what that means, I want to explore with all of you. So that's a very, like a whistle-stop tour of what leadership is in 23 minutes. I want to spend the rest of the time now talking with you and engaging with Migdad about Islamic leadership, prophetic leadership, so I can learn. Is that good? Will that be good? So Migdad, do you want to join me, please? And I will go back. Whoops. There you go. There you go. So please. So you're there with two wonderful boys. What are their names?
Bilal and Jawad.
Okay. So so anyone who's a parent knows about leadership for a start. But did you respond to anything that I said, or what did you respond to? How do you respond to the models that I gave as a Muslim, not as a successful executive only? Yeah.
Okay. I guess I see all of those models of leadership being exhibited by Muslim leaders in different places in society.
Yeah.
You see
Which ones? No, don't.
You see dictators doing a strong, within many elements of the Muslim world, doing a lot of the controller side of things. In a lot of the works on prophetic leadership, I've also seen people talk quite a lot about the sort of, I think it's Wal Halaq, I'm not saying, but they're people who talk about the charisma and the actual, the idea that the Prophet was someone who's charismatically, I think sometimes very often people seem to be using these concepts to try and almost backfill what they understand the Prophet to be, rather than necessarily the other way around. And it's interesting to see how some people have said, oh, the Prophet fits this exact criteria of a charismatic leader because he did these types of things which are quite similar. But I think I guess I agree, I would agree, wouldn't I, that it's always a balance across all of these things. But I do think from a Muslim perspective, noting there's no the Muslim perspective, but at least a Muslim perspective from me, I think the humility angle is a really important core of it, that as a society you develop more when you have everyone almost on the same bus voluntarily, but because you've persuaded them, but given them the opportunity to choose something different, and recognizing the limitations of yourself unless you're the Prophet. You can't be that level, and therefore there's always a humility because you can't be the Prophet.
Yeah, so it's very interesting, because even in your answers, I see opportunity for people to use, as every community does, faith against, to pull people down. So one thing that I've noticed, I work, as Migdad says, across all faiths to bring up leadership. And I don't know if it's fair, so let me ask, but is there, do you think, a particular propensity amongst British Muslims to bring other Muslims like who are showing leadership down? Like, is there a greater propensity than not? If I can ask you, and where does that come from?
Is it great? There is definitely an element of that.
As there is in every community.
As there is in every
Yeah.
community.
But do you think it's more in our community?
I think there is sometimes, if someone stands up and does something, there is a little bit of a nervousness around what that might entail and what
Yeah.
they're trying to do. And I think, depending on society, depending on situations, that can be quite strong.
And that could be, just to draw, that could be to do with a misunderstanding of prophetic leadership, right, or a misapplication of it. So when somebody says humility, that doesn't mean that you're so humble that you don't stand up.
No.
It actually means that you don't take it to your head. But actually, there is, if we just talk about some of the stuff I'm talking about, like the leader-follower dynamic in transformational leadership, if somebody is having the courage to lead, the other leaders who are called followers of that community should really support that person rather than like bring them down, particularly if that community is a vulnerable community, it seems to me. And that is what is meant by eco-leadership too. We're in an ecosystem, all of it. It doesn't mean environment. It means that we're actually in an ecosystem, and you do need leaders, you do need people to stand up and use all the skills that they have at their advantage. But the job of the leader is to, okay, sure, to make change and to create change, but also to ensure that the followers don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, you know what I mean? So what is meant, so you said, so humility is a particular thing, particular point. What else is, so from what little I know about Islamic leadership in a classic sense, firstly, my understanding was that there was a real great, in terms of diplomacy, and so Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad was one of our faculty members, and he gave a fascinating lecture on Islamic diplomacy. And he stated that in the olden days, if you were an ambassador or if you were a leader of any kind, you had to look a certain way. So the presentation, so all the stuff that we talk about, power dressing and all of that, it was already kind of there. I'm not saying it's power dressing, but you had to look a certain way. Why? Because you're building confidence. Then you had to have certain skills of communication and articulation. Then you had to have a whole series of other things, and at the core of it was an understanding that you're not doing this for yourself, you're doing this for someone else, and there comes the humility. You've been in all sorts of public fora, and you communicate as for a living in one sense, for all of us who are minorities, I think. Have you drawn any inspiration from those kind of principles?
I think so, very much so. I mean, I think the concept of why you're doing something is really important to it, because I think that changes the negatives that might come on the back of it. You're not doing it for yourself. You're doing it for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala eventually, and through community, and through for justice and equality, morality, ethics. Like, all of these are the fundamental reasons why you're doing all of these things, and that means that you always can check yourself about and say, well, is this the right thing to do given these principles that you're trying to achieve? And this is not a unique thing. Obviously, everyone thinks in some, should think in similar ways, and
I don't think people do. That's why leaders are in a real, leadership is in crisis, because people don't think about what's right. I think they think about what's expedient and short term. So just to move on then, is resilience, and do you have any stories of yourself or people you know, if you do, in terms of resilience? So that the idea is that a faith-based person, so prophetic leadership, somebody who believes in prophetic leadership, when they're attacked, when they're in the corner, like backs in the corner, they won't be destroyed, because they're doing it for a bigger reason. And that's not I'm not making I'm making an anthropological point, actually, because you do see studies again and again and again and again. The people who kind of stand up and carry on, fight another day, are people who believe in something bigger than the immediate short-term gain. And I always, like, a great example of that is what were the towers that were burnt here? The tower block, the Grenfell. Yeah, so Grenfell. So those who are the people, it happened to be, it was a Muslim charity. But what I'm saying is the people who are faith-based people who were there providing services to the families that were destroyed across the board remained there at night after the statutory services went home and did all sorts of things. And that's the thing about faith-based, they'll be there regardless. So, and that's a good and bad thing, because people know that people can kind of rely on you, including in your community, and you know, they kind of know that you're not going to go away. So you have to kind of learn that they know that you're transformational, and you've got to kind of learn to be transactional as well, because otherwise, you know, people will take advantage of you all the time. And actually, that's what's happening in certain countries like Italy, other places, where the entire welfare system, or large parts of the welfare system, is run by the Catholic Church, or, you know, not the government, because they think, oh yeah, the religious people will do it. But I wanted to delve into your stories, if any, about resilience.
Resilience is I think a challenge. I think in an environment where Islamophobia is quite prevalent, if you ever put your neck out there, you do get levels of quite significant levels of abuse in different ways. Those abuses, you know, they can be of different levels. They can be random people, or they can be people in positions of authority and positions of power, including newspapers, including advisors to government, including government ministers. It can be all the way out. And I think that the ability to be conscious of the landscape in which you are in and the ramifications of things that you do, that if someone who is in a similar position to you from other communities were to do, it wouldn't get that same vitriolic abuse or scrutiny or in any way. And so having a much higher standard that you have to hold yourself up to is ultimately the challenge. And it's not a challenge that is easily kept to. Like the expectations are sometimes insurmountable in terms of unachievable, sorry, in terms of how can you actually keep that level where you can't make even a slight mistake, otherwise there's a newspaper article which is going to be written on you, etc. Or more than that, if you have a team, I think this is a bigger thing, when you have a team together and you build a team and the team are not as used to this kind of microscope, the level of their, the expectation still remains very, very high, but it's not fair on them, and therefore they are very likely to fall short in many ways, not because of anything other than the fact they haven't been in the space as long. And they then get in a lot of trouble. And then, to be honest, the issue is not only that they face it, but you as the leader have created an organization or something which has put them into that place, and then they have got it as a result. So you're ultimately accountable for the vitriol they're facing, even though you haven't done anything, but you've created something which has meant it more likely that they receive that vitriol. So building resilience, both in terms of yourself and anyone who you partner with or work with, to be in that space becomes quite challenging. And yeah, it's true that the faith element is helpful in that. I guess it's a necessary but not sufficient type situation.
No.
Yeah.
Because the two other things then, I'm drawing from what I know about prophetic leadership for you to comment on. So we talked about humility, we talked about resilience, we talked about communication and presentation, courage, like the courage to put your head above the parapet and to inspire courage in others.
Yeah, I mean, that's always going to be, that is definitely the case. I think in an environment where Islam is more prevalent, and it's a difficult space to be in, I think it's even more.
But do you realize that courage, it's like, you know, from what you're saying, which I relate to, because I've watched you and I've watched others, it'd be easier not to put your head above the parapet. It'd be easier to just get on with life, as most of us want to do. But some people can't do that. And those people should be protected, I would suggest, rather than, you know, be kind of targets of envy. I'm not saying you are, but I'm just saying. But I noticed that, yeah.
So I think there's also an interesting concept that at least I think about, which is your duty. So
Yeah.
So I think the Quran talks about it. God doesn't give you anything other than your capacity. Like if you have the capacity to do something and you're not using it, that's a problem. I think the Bible talks about it's harder for a rich person to enter heaven than go through the eye of a needle. But the principle is because you've got so much more wealth, you've got so much more duty to do something with it. If you've got that position, a lot of people here are relatively fortunate, financially relatively well as okay, or some people will be, and if you've got that ability to do something, then you have a greater duty to do something with it. And if you don't do something with it, then you're kind of failing in doing what you could do. And I think that is also important, because whenever you have something, if you're not doing the maximum, you can't always do the maximum, but if you don't try and strive, and I think that's a good point, always striving for the better, I think فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ, always strive to do better, to do good deeds. If you don't use your capacity to do that, then I feel you're falling short. And I feel that's very Quranic in its basis. And the courage point, I definitely see that with in some spaces, in particular when it comes to looking at what's it called, like many of the faith leaders out there. When you're trying to do something against the establishment of the faith, that becomes even more. Courage is a bigger thing there as well. And yes, definitely courage in terms of standing up in the broader society also definitely plays an important role. Yeah.
And so the final one is, for me, awareness. So, great story is I work voluntarily with young people, and I love it. And we tell the famous story of the starfish thrower. There's a kid walking on the street along the beach, and there are all these starfish that have been washed up. And the kid then throws the starfish, and some older person says, what difference will it make? And the kid says, well, it will make a difference to this starfish. And it's a lovely little. So I would tell that to kids all the time, and then a couple of kids came back to me and said, you never guess what happened, and the parent was there as well. And they said, what? And I said, well, we went to a beach and we saw these starfish, or saw these creatures on the beach, and so we started throwing them into the sea until this man came up who owned the beach or whatever and said, what are you doing? And the kid said, there's this creature and I'm saving. And he said, no, these things live on the edge of the this river, and what you've done is just killed about 15 of them. So intention isn't only the right thing, all of these things, but the actual competence and awareness, which is what you have, if I may say so, is something that is really, really important too, I think. Any comment on that? Or just, because that's also part of prophetic leadership,
100%.
Wisdom.
Competence and wisdom are vital.
And hence the community, hence the elders, all of that thing.
Definitely, but insight is vital. I mean, you look at, we often talk about stories of the Prophet. I think in the madrasa last week, Ammar, who's not here, was talking about one of the battles in the past and how the Prophet told everybody to stand in a certain place, and when they didn't listen, that led to the defeat. But if they had listened, then actually there was a huge victory. I mean, the idea of competence is clear, right? You can't inspire people if you can't do the job properly and well, and actually be transformational in a positive way for the better. So yeah.
So that's our 40 minutes. In my very inept way, what I wanted to say is this, that I don't know what you think society, I'm talking about our country here, thinks about the resources that are in Islam. But for me, just few of the things we've just touched on, courage, humility, presentation, articulation, resilience, judgment, wisdom, those things our country needs, right? And if we're talking about leadership, we don't really need for those things to be defined by even Simon. Simon, who's one of the top lecturers and professors of leadership and theories of leadership, is looking for source material from these ancient wisdom traditions, including Islam, to inform what he does, not the other way around. And this is why our faith communities, and if I may say so, your tradition in particular, has so much to offer and is so needed. And I really think that we need more people like McDowd out there to represent that leadership.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions, if there are any questions from either side.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation. It was quite stimulating. And I want to bring in two macro themes, if you like. You talked about the Second World War and the problems that resulted from it. And my reading is that people were so disappointed with the system that a lot of them would have turned to communism if we didn't do anything. This fear led people like Beveridge and others to look at the whole idea of a welfare state. It was, of course, also motivated by Christian ethics and so on. And it worked for 30 years until those guys, the Thatcherites and Reaganites, came and said, this is too much, tax is too high, so on and so forth. But if we have a perfect welfare system, and this idea of giving rather than hoarding, which benefits everybody, would be there. Now, if you want to compare that to Islam, the idea is that always been there, that what you have been given by Allah is not yours. It is a trust from Him. So if you are wealthy, you have a heavy duty to make sure that you discharge that trust. So that welfare state will be now based on belief. And over in the Quran it says, you give and we will double it, triple it, quadruple it. If you have faith, you do that. But as you know, if you don't have faith, you say, no, I have only £5. If I give that, what will happen to me? But there are Muslims who are quite keen. If you now build it into a kind of welfare system, faith-based, I think you will see a complete transformation of society. And I don't know if you have read it. One of the books which really takes stock of all these things currently is Thomas Piketty. Capitalism in the 21st century. Because he uses a Marxist terminology, people have, but it was a bestseller for a long time. And there he documents how rich people try to monopolize and get people to forget about the problems of the poor, which you can see now, increase in inequality and so on. And he builds on a number of things. It's worth reading. So if you bring the faith perspective in there, you automatically create leadership models which are worth aspiring to. And you, at a macro level, obviously there is individual, there is humility, but if you have this belief, so as Mikdad said, in Christianity, there was belief that you shouldn't have wealth because if you have wealth, you will never go to heaven. Muslims don't say, so you can have as much wealth as you want or as you are given, but remember that it's not yours. It is a kind of, trust from God on behalf of the people.
I mean, I agree with everything you've said. And just to say, wealth now, in the next decade or so, will change. Like, fresh air is wealth. I just came back from France today, where I was staying with an 86-year-old guy. He invented the touch screen, so he's really smart. And he was saying, I was staying with him for a particular reason, but he's saying the whole way the world, you know, with alternative currencies and all these things that I don't understand, technologies, other things, the whole definition of what we value and what money is there to enable is going to change, and it's going to be egalitarian in the way that you're saying. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, exactly. In the way you're saying, I'm saying.
So I have 1.5 questions.
Okay, 1.5 questions. So, would Erdogan fit into the therapist model?
Erdogan, I don't know too much about him. I'm so
All right,
sorry.
he's the president of
Turkey, but
yeah.
like in what way?
I mean, in the ways that his policies, his ways of doing things. I don't know if you've, because for example, initially he was not in favor of doing anything with Israel, for example. Now the public opinion has forced him to some degree to actually change his stance. Anyway, that's one thing. The second, the main thing is that, you know, we talked about leadership and within the communities and stuff like, and how people want to bring them down. I think one of the issues is that when you, as a leader, you start exhibiting an ego, that's the downfall. And that's where people dislike it. Yeah, a person with an ego is not really thinking about them, it's thinking about themselves. Is that the right sort of way of looking at that?
Yeah, I mean, we all have egos, and sometimes you do things for, you know, that may be right for the ego. The trouble with somebody who's dealing with you know, if you're dealing with somebody with an ego in any relationship, it always spoils. So what I'm saying is leadership is about relationships, and ego never helps with relationships, right? So, absolutely. And you want somebody to be but that, you know, can I just say, like, the very idea of, like, when I was a kid, like my role models within my own community, I'm just talking about my own community, so Asian men, a particular model was kind of controller, you know, ego. You wouldn't like approach such and such a person because you'll damage their ego. There are benefits to that because there are boundaries, you know, because you don't want to, but you can't necessarily confide in someone who's, you know, it depends what you mean by ego, but there's only so far you can go. So, yeah, so it's about balance, as McDowell said, but yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for your lecture. I really appreciate it. You know, when you were talking about the example of Grenfell and the role of the faith communities who stayed beyond the statutory services, you mentioned that faith-based communities or faith-based service needs to go from transformational to more of a transactional role. I put a question mark on that. That sort of takes away from that role of that leadership. So I wanted you to build on that, on why does it have to go from transformational to transactional. And building on that, this transformational leadership where communities and faith-based communities or people that are doing it for a bigger purpose are always there. How do we create systems where it becomes more systematic? And therefore, if it's more systematic, that load is distributed. So I was wondering if you could comment on this.
If I said that, I didn't mean to say, I mean, that's not what, I'm not saying big from transformational become transactional. What I'm saying is transformational is so big that there is transactional in it. So, like most people would consider Nelson Mandela to be a transformational leader, right? He did so many transactional things. You know, he was a master of transactional stuff, like to the point where, and you know, talk about ego, but I mean, he himself existentially had no ego, but when he got cross, you'd know it, right? So again, Gandhi people think is transformational. Going on hunger strike or whatever the word is, like fasting. If you don't, I will kill myself by fasting if you continue doing this. That's transactional. Like voting is transactional. I'll do so. And also systems. It depends on the situation as to how to create a system to kind of make any change. But the very idea of systematically doing something is also transactional. So that's what I'm saying. The process can be transactional in order to create a transformational result. But it depends on the situation. I can't create a system. Are you thinking of something specific?
No, I haven't thought of something specific. But even if it was systematic to create something transformational, isn't that far better?
That's what I'm saying. It's necessary. Yeah. That's how you create change. No change is done like in a peaceful way. If you're dealing with masses, you need systems. Yeah. Otherwise, it becomes arbitrary.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We will end there. Salat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. And Krish is around after prayers if you have any direct questions as well. Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن عليا ولي الله أشهد أن عليا ولي الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح حي على خير العمل حي على خير العمل الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد. الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. هيا على الصلاة هيا على الصلاة هيا على الفلاح هيا على الفلاح هيا على خير الأمل هيا على خير الأمل. قد قامت الصلاة قد قامت الصلاة. الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إني وجهت وجهي للذي فطر السماوات والأرض حنيفا وما أنا من المشركين. الله أكبر. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إنا أنزلناه في ليلة القدر وما أدراك ما ليلة القدر. ليلة القدر خير من ألف شهر تنزل الملائكة والروح فيها بإذن ربهم من كل أمر سلام هي حتى مطلع الفجر. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر. حول الله وقوة. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين. إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قل هو الله أحد الله الصمد لم يلد ولم يولد ولم يكن له كفوا أحد. الله أكبر. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد وعلى محمد. الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. بحول الله. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي العظيم وبحمد ربي صل على محمد. سمع الله لمن حمده. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد. الله أكبر. استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه. الله أكبر. سبحان ربي الأعلى وبحمد ربي صل على محمد. الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له أشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. اللهم صل على محمد. السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته. السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. الله أكبر. اللهم صل
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد.
اللهم صل.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إني أسألك موجبات رحمتك وعزائم مغفرتك ونجاتي من النار من كل بلية والفوز بالجنة والرضوان في الدار السلام وجوه نبيك محمد عليه وآله السلام. اللهم ما بنا من نعمة فمنك لا إله إلا أنت استغفرك وأتوب إليك.
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله. أشهد أن عليا حجة الله. هيا على الصلاة هيا على